So our next speaker is Dr. Kirsten Lykkegaard. She is a doctor of veterinary medicine and also holds a PhD in pharmacology. For over 19 years, she has contributed to fundamental biomedical research within the somatic pain, obesity, and type 2 diabetes areas. As co-director of research at the Institute, Kirsten's current focus is on developing effective psycho-immunology treatments for specific viral and bacterial diseases. So our next speaker is Dr. Kirsten Lykkegaard. She is a doctor of veterinary medicine and also holds a PhD in pharmacology. For over 19 years, she has contributed to fundamental biomedical research within the somatic pain, obesity, and type 2 diabetes areas. As co-director of research at the Institute, Kirsten's current focus is on developing effective psycho-immunology treatments for specific viral and bacterial diseases. She is also investigating the causes of diseases of unknown etiology, such as autism. Today, she's going to speak about health and disease from a peak states perspective. Thank you, Kirsten.
My talk today is called Fueled by Curiosity, Health and Disease from a peak states perspective. And the curiosity part is actually what started the Institute, because Grant, he was so fortunate to be born with an exceptional state of being. And it led to very curious very much curiosity around why aren't more people experiencing these great states, and later on also why are people actually getting sick. So what is it that we do? I know Gatan has already touched on it and Celine has expanded, but I'm going to take it just to a little different part here, because if you think about it, a lot of people say, well, aren't you just another form of alternative therapy? And hey, why wouldn't you think so? Because what we do is we actually use these subjective data like emotions and unusual kinesthetic experiences. And as every scientist knows, that subjective or personal data are very noisy. And so it's actually very valid to think so, but I would actually argue that that's a bit wrong. And to actually do this, I got curious to see what is it that makes us different from biomedicine. And how is it that our process of working is actually very scientific? And why are we successful in actually achieving some results within very hard diseases that no one has had any success with so far? And so this curiosity led to key questions, and I came up with 4. So what is health and disease? And why has biomedicine gotten stuck in finding cures for many chronic diseases, like both physical and mental? How can biomedicine advance the chances of successful solutions? And how is it that what we do in ISPS is an extension of biomedicine? So if we think about the world right now, and this is obvious to everyone, but I'll just highlight it here in saying that people suffer from more and more diseases. Here's from CDC. This is, as you can see, a map of the United States. This here depicts the obesity rate. So this is the incidence or the frequency of obesity as rated with the color here. This is diabetes type 2, and that's over 25 years ago. And this is 2000. In 2000, this is 2005. As you can see, it just gets worse and worse. And so these are chronic diseases, and they are just exploding all over the world. In the US, in 20 years ago, it was 50% of every US citizen that actually had a chronic disease, and that over half of them had multiple chronic diseases. And this is not just what we see in the older population. We actually also see that younger people suffer more and more from other things like depression or autism, ADHD, and other psychiatric or mental illnesses. So the world is actually not in a good space, and we need to actually get better at understanding why this is. And we actually exist as an institute because we believe that the world can be a better place. And that's, I guess, very heroic, but we have a background of saying so because we also believe that the human species was designed to work optimally, like perfect mental and physical health, and we are not in the moment. And that is because the human species got screwed up by pathogen infections in our ancestors. Mary was touching a bit upon that, that our species got run over by a lot of things. And if you look at our genome, you can see that there's just so much crap in there. And what we believe in the Institute is that we actually can return to what we were meant to be. So we're aiming at this perfect health, mentally and physically, in our work. So we were all brought up believing that if you think of this as the population of the world, and if you think of health, if you're in this part of this curve here, you're among the lucky ones, you have a good health. And if you're down here, you're less lucky, more sick and so on. And so all you can do is strive to get up into this part of the curve. So we call this average health, but from an institute perspective, this is actually suboptimal health. And that is because all of humanity, basically, pretty much everyone, has these underlying vulnerabilities that are set up as epigenetic, like Celine was talking about, but also pathogenic wise. What Grant had observed when he started out was that it's actually, there is a bimodal distribution of health. There are some people, there are very few, and this, as you can see, I've said this is not to scale. We don't know how many are in this group, but they exist. And in that group, people are extraordinary in one way or the other by having either exceptional states of being, like having the beauty way. They can be having unconditional love, like Dalai Lama. It can be an IQ state where you just experience the world and all the knowledge in like in one holistic way of thinking about it. It's very good for making breakthroughs. So there are a few people out there in the world who are able to do that. So this is the concept that has brought us to a different place in our model than biomedicine. This is what we would consider optimal health, and that's what we're striving to actually gain back. So in this talk, I'm talking about disease, and I'm also talking about biomedicine, or the biomedical model. With biomedical model and biomedicine, I mean the normal standard Western way of thinking about medicine. And with disease, I'm going to frame the more chronic diseases. So the ones that actually are not so well understood and that we don't have a good treatment for so far. We have maybe good symptom treatments for some of them, but what we're aiming at is actually a full understanding so that we can target it fully. So let's take a look at this a little bit black and white maybe, but so look at it from this perspective. Disease is always physical. It's a malfunction at the molecular and cellular level. And because of that, and because it's usually a lack or too much of something, diseases can be targeted by pharmaceutical interventions. Like if you have depression, it's a lack or an imbalance of your neurotransmitters, it can be targeted. If you lack insulin in type 2 diabetes, you just pour in some more insulin or try to kind of alleviate the symptoms. There's a thinking that's dualistic. That means that everything that's physical belongs to doctors. If it's anything that has to do with the psyche, you have to go to a psychiatrist or a psychologist. There is also a reductionistic thinking, which means that everything can be broken down and treated on an individual level. So not thinking of the human as a being of, it goes along with the dualism in a way that your mind's not affecting your body. And everything can be explained by a lower level of molecular thinking. And also health from this perspective can be seen as the most optimum is to not have any diseases, so the absence of disease. So let's look at chronic disease. This is just an analogy for this. So you're well, and now comes a disease, and it hits you and creates an avalanche. Now, at this point, you have the disease, and we have all these tools to look at what's in this avalanche. And this is actually where, if you think about textbooks of medicine, they describe everything really well of what's going on in here, the damage, the pathways that have gone wrong, the regulation of genes and everything that's offset in this perspective. So, but it's a lot of noise in here. There's in this picture lots of snow, gravel, rocks, tree branches, tree trunks, dirt, earth, debris, and even silage. And so when you think about it, this is the confusion, I think. You're looking at all of this, and we all are. We can see this is what's going on. And so why is it that biomedicine is stuck in finding cures for these diseases? Well, one of the reasons is, like I think Mary also touched on, is the current paradigm. The really good maps, like the map of the avalanche and what's gone wrong in there, is really descriptive and thorough. But sometimes incorrect conclusions gets pulled out of this, and they get turned into dogma or truth. So like in the 90s, everything about cardiovascular was due to our diet containing too much cholesterol. And we know that cholesterol does play a role in this disease, but it kind of made the whole field go in one direction for a long time. So that's what happens a lot of times. And if you're a student in this world, it's really hard to know where a study that might have been done really well back in times have been wrongly concluded or been put in terms of this is the truth. The other way that we do think of it in medicine is that, well, chronic diseases are just so complex in nature, so it's not caused by one thing, so you can't really solve it. All you can do is manage it. So you can treat it to alleviate symptoms. And so if that's your thinking, that's how you will also get the treatments. The other thing is that this paradigm ignores how powerful our psyche is actually to influence the immunity. I mean, stress does play a role. That's been acknowledged a lot in medicine, but it's far beyond that. So the ignoring of the mind-body interaction, and then that as medicine, we don't really, we acknowledge that there is such a thing as placebo, but it's not studied. Why is it that actually if you treat in certain diseases with saline instead of a treatment that people do get well if they believe so? So those are things that are missing or not taking in. The current paradigm is ignoring. The other thing is that data that are not uniformly, say that you do a study and there's in a clinic study that could be a large percentage of people who don't respond, and so you don't follow up on why did that not happen? You know, are we actually studying a uniform group in the first place? I mean, the whole thing is not followed all the way. So that's one thing. That's the paradigm. That plays out in the streetlight effect, and everyone knows the story about the drunken man who's seeking his dime, and the policeman comes over and says, "What are you looking for?" And the guy says, "I lost my dime and a quarter." It's probably a quarter. And the guy says, "Well, where did you lose it?" And the drunken says, "Well, I lost it over there." And so it's right over there. And he says, "Why are you looking over here?" "Well, the light is over here, so it's better." And the story goes that they actually start just looking in this light. And that's what, there's lots of, I mean, all this is knowledge of, that is known to the biomedicine world. Everyone knows that this is a problem, yet funding is given to people who study under the light, not to people in the dark. Everything is about, you get rewarded for publishing something that is tying up to what's already known. You can do something that's new, maybe in the periphery of this, but it's really hard to go out in the dark. So we look back at the avalanche. How do you know what's important in all of this? So if you don't have a model, how would you know what of all of this is important in solving the problem? And so when you think about the Institute here, you probably heard that the background that Grant came in with was that he had an engineering degree from Stanford. And so he wasn't brought up in the medical field. And of course, he grew up in the Western world, and his father was a doctor and his mom was a nurse, but still he got the mindset from an engineering perspective. And that is one of the reasons that we have made different turns, and therefore progress in our work. So if you take a look at the difference, first of all, if you take a look at the model, the underlying model in biomedicine does not include feedback principles, whereas engineering always. Think about type 2 diabetes. You know, that's a disease where insulin is not working very well, so the insulin receptor is not sensitive. And in biomedicine, we actually address that by drugs that can enhance the sensitivity of the receptor. And if that doesn't work well enough, then the patient gets insulin on top of that. That means we pour more stuff on the receptor. Instead, an engineer would think differently on that. There is something wrong. Maybe the insulin receptor is actually acting properly. I mean, this is, if you think of a homeostasis, the insulin receptor is there to regulate glucose in the bloodstream. So there must be some other way around that where there's a fault. Maybe the insulin receptor is responding accurate in the system, and there's something at fault in the equilibrium, the homeostasis of the system someplace else. If you think of the engineering way, a house, for example, it has a thermostat. That means that the house wouldn't overheat. If you put the analogy back to the medicine, it would be that your house is so hot that the solution would be that you wear shorts and go down and get a lot of ice in the convenience store. So, and also, next point here that I put in is how do they deal with noise? In biology, what we do is that we make studies that include large groups so that we can calculate what's called the p-value. That's the possibility or the probability that what you're studying and what results you're seeing is not a coincidence. Instead, in engineering, you actually see that there's noise. So to sort of know where's your signal, what is it that you're measuring, you try to compute the noise. You build the noise into your model, and therefore you don't need to calculate the p-value. And as Mary said, if you think about adjusting to new knowledge, it is very slow. It's actually been very well documented that even if a study shows that this treatment is so much better than we usually do with this treatment, it takes on an average 17 years to integrate that for all over the world. Whereas with engineering, if there is new knowledge, it integrates immediately and it's very welcomed. So as it is adding to solving the problems that we're looking at. And so how do you measure success? In studies, clinical studies, the common terminology is that you need to be better than placebo. And as I just said, placebo in some diseases can be up to 30%. So just better than 30%. If you have something on the market, like you take your smartphone, it has to work 99.7% of the time. That's actually the standard for 3 sigma for a product. So if you think of these differences here, that might actually be, and I would say that's the second reason that I think biomedicine is not succeeding in solving these complex problems like we're looking at with chronic diseases. So when you have a model, and I think Katana already said a lot of this, you can actually focus on the few things that your model predicts that are important. So back to the avalanche, it might be that, you know, the gravel was important because that was maybe part of what was causing the avalanche in the first place. But only if you have a model, you can focus in on it. When you have your model, you can actually then predict outcomes, and then you can set up new studies that test this. You can make applications, test them, and see if you're right. And there is this interaction between model and measuring tool. Think of the measuring tool as when you saw the streetlight and the coin was over to the side, that if you have a tool, it actually acts like a flashlight. Then you can go over and look for the coin. And how they go together is actually underestimated in lots of thinking. I mean, when you do it, you know that it's very linked. Like the stomach ulcers that Mary was talking about. So Barry Marshall, the Australian doctor, who proposed that that ulcers were caused by Helicobacter bacteria. If their measuring tool, which was to cultivate from people who had gastritis and stomach ulcers. If they had not improved on the measuring tool, the tool was to cultivate the bacterial extracts from the bellies of patients, then they would actually have failed in this. They did cultivating for 2 days. None of the patients came out positive. There were nothing in them. So the first study that he did, his hypothesis was like everyone was looking at him saying, "You're wrong. There's no bacteria in this." And then over the weekend, one day, his lab technicians forgot to throw out the petri dishes that they usually threw out on day 2. So on Monday, they had grown for an additional 2 days. And that allowed the Helicobacter, which is a slow growing bacteria, to actually show up. So that highlights that it's really important to have that. So let's take a look at our model. It's the primary cell model, and it is what we call a unifying model. And now we go back to the initial question that Grant asked was, why aren't more people in great peak states of consciousness? Why are people sick? What ties these things together? If you think about it, biology and medicine, they totally ignore spirituality. Medicine separates itself from psychology. And so there's no way that these things actually in the present ties together. So the question is, how do they tie together? And only if you take a torch or a flashlight and go and look out in the dark, you will find what might tie them together. You can't find it in the light. So the key things that Grant asked was that was intrinsic to his knowledge was their great peak states of consciousness exist. So this bimodal distribution, and that was the key difference. So, and then he had a gut feeling or an intuition that prenatal traumas were key. And that means you know that there is a coin, you have an intuition that there is a coin out in the dark. Now let's go measure it and find it. And so before he could do that, he actually had, with this intuition of prenatal trauma, you have to have a tool to know if that's the case. So he invented the wholehearted healing method of trauma healing, the regression that both Grant, Gaetan and Celine touched on. And after that, it actually is also that our progress started really rolling when the primary cell was discovered. If you think about it, if you know that you need to measure milliliters, but you only have bucket liters as your tool, again, the relationship between the model and your tool, or your measuring tool. How do you know if your model is wrong, if your measuring tool is not accurate enough? So they kind of go together, and most breakthroughs are actually made where new tools for measuring what you are hypothesizing exists go together. And a lot of people gave Grant a lot of talk about, don't do this, you're not following mainstream, you should, your career is under risk. So again, this going away from the streetlight where you cannot get acknowledged. So let's go to the primary cell. As you've seen earlier today, this cell that it comes together at conception is actually the foundation of every cell in your body. It harbors the vulnerability to health and to diseases. However healthy this cell is, determines your ability to have peak states, it determines whether you're prone to diseases. And it does so by having epigenetic lockdowns in areas, and they can be either biographical or generational. So either in your own lifetime or in your prior ancestors. There can be structural damage inside this cell, and there can be pathogens that are psychoactive, and they are passed from your parent to the egg and sperm, so vertically transmission. These three things that actually causes vulnerability are not I wouldn't say they're unknown, but they're not known in the way that we know them in biomedicine. And so if you think of that cell that's created at the fourth cell division, the primary cell gets created, and we model that consciousness resides in this cell. It's a totipotent stem cell. That means it actually has the potential to become any cell, even the placenta. So it contains everything that's you. And in this primary cell, it actually, the reason it's so powerful is that it is the primary, it's the feedback loop, you can say. It's the set point of the whole body, because it's bidirectional to all cells in the body, but it is the one that is the master control. So it can tell other cells what to do. The other cells can't. In turn, they can give feedback. And the reason we know this is that when we work with the primary cell and we do things in here, the whole body responds in seconds to minutes. So as you've heard, that we can heal things and they disappear so quickly. So what happens is that we superimpose the perception and well-being of the cell onto a multicellular body. That means that we actually can experience diseases at 2 levels and work with them at 2 levels. Most people can perceive this either visually or kinesthetically. The implication of this model here is that it gives us the basis for finding what's the cause of unknown diseases of unknown etiology, so we can actually study them in the primary cell. The other thing is that once we find the cause of a disease, then you are able to do treatments with whatever technique you want to, as long as you know how to do that. That means we need to be able to measure it in a terminology that can be addressed with, for example, medicine. But we can make different treatments in our own standard techniques for doing so. Also, because it unifies all known experiences, it can actually answer questions that have been, I guess, on the minds of the human species for thousands of years about the nature of consciousness, biology, and medicine. So if you just take a sample of how we work out these processes of using the primary cell. So our model predicts that, for example, if you have Asperger's is a syndrome where people feel that they can't feel the world and they can't feel what other people feel. They can't relate. It has lots of psychological descriptions. Just looking at the ICD-10 or the DSM-5. But our model says that there is a unique symptom, a kinesthetic or emotion that every person with Asperger's syndrome has. And that this symptom is either caused by a pathogen or damage inside the primary cell. Trauma is involved, of course, but it's not it's not just a generational thing. So we also know that the overlay of the primary cell gives all the symptoms in the body. And in this case, the person feels cut off from the environment. What we found by looking at all this together with people who have the disease is that there is a bacterial coating on the outside of what we experience in the primary cell as being our self. And that coating in people can be either at far distance or it can be really tightly closed in on them. And depending on that, their symptom might be very severe or they can cope better. They can cope better if it's farther out. And we can design techniques to heal this and get rid of this cylinder and the experience that is experienced as a cylinder. So, and this is actually one of the key reasons why we are different than any other alternative therapy, is that we are not based on a technique, we are based on a model, the understanding, and we can design different techniques to solve the same problem in biology. So the last key thing that I will just elaborate on is, if you think about how are we an extension of biomedicine? Well, diseases affect cellular pathways in multicellular system in our bodies. At least that's what biomedicine is saying. We agree, but there are other diseases that don't show up per se as what you can measure as cellular pathways. So we are extending, you can say, on that knowledge, also by including the master control of all feedback loops, the primary cell. We include an understanding of psycho-immunology, that our psyche is so powerful that by healing the right traumas, we can get immune to pathogens. We allow emotional subjective data to be important. We are very, very good at actually dealing with that as a tool. Again, in engineering, any tool has its weaknesses, but knowing what they are, you can actually have workarounds for it. And number 4, we include the primary cell disease, and that allows us to understand things that are of unknown etiology, and that includes most chronic physical, mental, and also psychosomatic diseases. So just in conclusion, so our understanding of health and disease include these extraordinary states of consciousness as well as immunity to diseases. You can be immune to diseases as part of that biomedical distribution that I showed first. Biomedicine is limited by the current paradigm and is not looking enough outside the streetlight. There is actually an article that in itself has this in its title. It's called Streetlight Effect in Type 1 Diabetes. So that the biomedical field knows that this is going on, and that is definitely a limitation. An engineering approach with an underlying unifying model would be helpful for developing predictable and effective treatments. And in our work, biomedical data are important, and we extend on the biomedical knowledge. So I hope this presentation was somewhat helpful in mapping where are we in perspective to other treatments and biomedicine as such. So thank you.